introduce our speaker, and we will spotlight her so you can be sure to see. Our speaker today is Luci Zahray, also known as the Poison Lady. Luci, who has a master's degree in toxicology from Texas A&M, has been helping writers who need to know how they can dispatch fictional victims with poisons. As a retired hospital pharmacist and avid mystery reader, Luci quickly became the source to be consulted and offers her knowledge to many authors in need of expertise. Welcome, Luci.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So today we're going to talk about a few of the poison plants. Most of these I do grow in my backyard. So if you need pictures of when the plants look like, and not all the pictures are from my backyard, but most of them are. So anyway, today, I think I can't change the screen while you've spotlighted it.
Well, I'll spotlight you here. Hold on just a moment. Can you get to it now?
Oh, yep, here we go. Okay, so these two are the reference books that I recommend most. The Poisonous Plants of the United States and Canada is out of print, but you can still find copies of this book around. Comes in 3 different editions, so a lot of information, not quite so much information, and a quick review. And the other book, Common Poisonous Plants and Mushrooms in North America, that is the best book that I have ever found for a reference book. It is on the way out of being in print right now, but you can still find copies. And I have no idea what's up with Amazon, because sometimes you can get it on Kindle and sometimes you can't. But if you ever get a chance to get it on Kindle, you want to snap it up right away. So today we're going to talk about the deadly nightshade plants, the member of the Solanaceae family. So we'll cover deadly nightshade, which is Atropia belladonna, henbane, which is Hyoscyamus nigra, Jimson weed, which is Datura stramonium, mandrake, which is Atropia mandragoria, and tobacco, which is nicotine. So all of the members of these deadly nightshade plant have alkaloids in them. Alkaloids are a class of compounds. They are basic, which means they have a pH greater than 7. They're naturally occurring organic compounds that contain at least 1 nitrogen atom. Alkaloids are fairly easy to extract. You can usually get any of these poisons with a small amount of water and maybe a small amount of the base to raise the pH. And even limited purification is possible. So you can mix it with water and alcohol and shake it up, and it will divide, and you can see where the alkaloids are in what layer, and then pour it off. And so it works out really well. Most of them will have a bitter taste, and almost all are pharmacologically active. Early alkaloids are found in plants, so generically they're associated with plants. However, there are alkaloids that are produced by bacteria, fungus, and animals. And there are even a few new synthetic alkaloids. Interestingly enough, the venom of almost all ants is an alkaloid. And in Texas, we have horrible fire ants, and there's solenopsin is the alkaloid in fire ants. So alkaloids have been used historically, recreationally, in religion, as poisons, as medicines, but they weren't really well understood until the early 19th century. So the first isolated was morphine around 1804, quinine 1820, strychnine 1818. And this just gives you a little bit of information about when the chemistry was first known. So if you write a historic book, then this will give you some idea here. So some of the later ones was cocaine in 1860. And they're still finding out about alkaloids because that solanopsin from fire ants wasn't isolated until the 1960s. So alkaloids have been used for a wide range of medicines. They're used to treat disease. Think of malaria and quinine, various conditions. Think asthma and theobromine and theophylline. We treat cancer with vincristine and taxine, cardiac arrhythmias with quinidine, pain with morphine. They can be psychotropic alkaloids, so psilocin stimulants such as cocaine, caffeine, nicotine, theobromine, and they can cause a wide range of birth defects. Cyclopine, which actually causes a cyclops birth defect. So that's from corn lily, and colchicine, which is from autumn crocus. The second poison plant talk has autumn crocus in it because that's one of my favorite poison plants. So most members of the nightshade family have tubular roots. Think of a potato. They have 5-lobe petunia-like flowers. The flowers flare at the mouth, and they're generally white to green to yellowish with occasionally a little bit of purple in there. They mostly have simple, broad, hairy, strongly scented leaves. The scent is almost universally unpleasant. The fruits are capsules that contain many small seeds. So the fruit pods that we have on the bottom left are from my backyard, the datura, and then the one in the center is what the seed pods look like when they crack open. And those little seeds sort of look like a brain inside there. And if you were to take those seeds, which are one of the more potent parts of the plant, and sprinkle a little paprika on them and put them in the oven, they would look pretty much exactly like red pepper flakes. So that would be a way to describe it, disguise it when you were going to use it for food. So all parts of the plant are toxic, both fresh or dried. The amount of alkaloids may vary with the part of the plant, the location where they're grown, the time of the year, and the growing conditions. So if you're in Texas and you're having a hot, dry summer, then the concentration may be a little bit higher than if you're in, say, Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, where you have a cool, moist growing season. Where the plants grow faster, then you may have a little less concentration of the alkaloids. Usually at the end of the growing season, the concentrations will be higher. Usually the leaves and the roots and the seeds will have the highest concentration, but that can vary. And so if you need to know, you can always ask me and I can look it up for you or tell you what it is. So this is just a fast screen. It gives you a little bit of idea of what the structures are. Nicotine is one of the simplest of the molecules. Strychnine is one of the most complicated. So this is not something you'd probably ever need unless you're writing a medical thriller. So we're first going to talk about deadly nightshade, Atropia belladonna, henbane, and ginseng weed. So these plants all contain atropine and its related alkaloids. Scopolamine is one of them. It's sometimes called hyoscine and is the left optical isomer of atropine. So atropine is a mixture of the right and left-hand isomers. Then you have hyoscyamine and belladonna. Other members of the nightshade family include nicotine, which we'll talk about in a little bit as another poison plant, and then potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants. It's interesting because potatoes and tomatoes were once thought to be very poisonous. In fact, when potatoes were first introduced to Ireland, the country we most closely associate with potatoes, the people wouldn't eat them. They actually had to bring out cookbooks, and the nobles had to say how much they were enjoying potatoes before people just accepted it as a common food. So atropine and scopolamines have a reputation as being an aphrodisiac, and breaking down advances to sexual adventures. So you'll see it used in books where it's similar to rohypnol or ketamine, but scopolamine is a lot easier to come by because you can just grow it in your garden. So all of these plants, along with monkshood and opium poppies, can be found in a witch's garden or a poison plant garden. Their hallucinogenic effect played a very important role in a witch's flying ointment. Because they're found throughout Europe, Great Britain, and the Americas, there's a fair amount of history and folklore associated with these plants. So Atropia is named for Atropos, one of the three fates. Cleo was the spinner whose thread measured the length of life. Spun the thread of life. Lathos was the allocator who measured the length of life, and Atropos was the inflexible who cut the thread of life. So she decided when you were to die. Atropia is also supposedly the plant used to make the sleeping potion in Hamlet and the poison on the apple for Snow White. Henbane has been a poison poured into the ghost ear in Macbeth, and the dead in Hades or hell are crowned with henbane. The name Jensenweed for datura is derived from the incident at Jamestown when British troops who were sent off to put down the Bacon Revolution in 1576, running low on supplies, went out to forage, and then they found datura. And if you read the historical accounts, they didn't necessarily die. A lot of them did die, but a lot of them just had hallucinations, and the hallucinations from datura can last weeks. Thornapple is the name from the spikes on the seed pods. So those thorny seed pods at the first slide, those are from my backyard, and that's what the seed pods look like. And they are very thorny and very sticky. So one of the things you can do if you're writing a historical book or even a modern book is know that political unrest or wars can disrupt drug supplies. Famously, during the American Civil War, when the North blockaded southern parts, medicines were cut off. Most medicines that were imported came from France, and those all dried up. So they put out little newsletters, basically, which told farmers what to grow and how to harvest it and how to send it off to the army or to troops. And then in 1908, Croatia and Slavonia exported approximately 30,000 pounds of dried belladonna root, which was really the world's supply of atropine. And then supplies were cut off in 1914 at the beginning of the First World War. So this is what Atropia belladonna looks like. Datura is the easiest of the poison plants to grow. In fact, growing datura is never a problem. Weeding it out of your yard is a problem. Atropia belladonna is also pretty easy to grow. My original plant came to me from a bird. So one day I was just out looking around in the yard, and lo and behold, I had this poison plant that I'd been trying to grow for a long time that was just a bird donation. So this is what henbane looks like. Again, it's a little difficult for me to grow in Texas because it doesn't really like the hot weather. It does grow better. These plants are from my yard in Michigan, so it did like the cooler climate a little bit. You can grow it down here. You just sort of have to baby it along a little bit. So remember, the dose makes the difference. That's actually the definition of a poison. So the dose makes the difference between a poison and a life-saving medicine. Atropine is classified as an essential medication by the World Health Organization because it's used in so many different ways. It dries up secretions before and after surgery. It's used in hospice patients. It treats and prevents nausea. So if you go on a cruise ship and you need something for seasickness, the best thing to get is the transderm scopolamine. So it's a scopolamine patch that you put behind your ear. It's mixed with opium to treat diarrhea. It increases heart rate. So if you have a cardiac code and the person's heart won't beat fast enough, you can give them atropine. It's used to dilate the eyes in ophthalmology and eye surgery. And that's where the name belladonna comes from. It means beautiful eyes. So in historical times, medieval times, that big dilated eye pupil was thought to be beautiful. And so women would put belladonna in their eyes. It's used to treat nerve gas poisonings, and it's used to treat organophosphate poisoning. So in Texas, we have a lot of organophosphates, so everybody has a good supply of atropine around. Symptoms include abdominal pain, dry mouth, flushing, fever, dilated pupils, urinary retention, disorientation, visual disturbances, hallucinations, coma, and death from heart or respiratory failure. A lot of times it'll be from respiratory failure, but you can, if the dose is sufficiently large, sort of skip to heart failure. Symptoms can occur within 15 to 30 minutes, or they can be delayed for as long as 12 hours. Same thing with death. Sometimes it can be very rapid, sometimes it can be delayed. And that's why poison plants work so well for murder mystery authors, because there are so many different ways we can change how a poison plant works in the system. So again, if the victim survives their symptoms and gets support from either in a hospital or first aid, they usually wear off within 2 to 4 hours, although the visual disturbances and hallucinations can last up to 2 to 3 weeks. Again, in Jamestown, during the British soldiers complained of hallucinations that lasted 2 to 3 weeks. So soldiers who may be exposed to nerve gases are issued with only 2 self-injectors, and they must not use them unless nerve gas exposure is confirmed, because otherwise you'll have all your soldiers being poisoned with atropine poisoning. There are several mnemonics that are for remembering the symptoms to atropine and atropine-like alkaloids. The most common one is blind as a bat, because it affects your eyes, mad as a hatter for the hallucinations, dry as a bone, because it dries up your mouth and your bladder and your GI tract. The bowel and bladder lose their tone, the heart runs alone. So if you want the really down and dirty fast version, it's can't see, can't spit, can't pee, can't shit. And the more spiritual version is eat a little, get to sleep, eat some more, have a dream, eat yet more, don't wake up. So atropine has a very narrow therapeutic index. That's another reason why soldiers aren't given very much or aren't allowed to use it without confirmation of nerve gas poisonings, which makes this narrow therapeutic index makes overdoses very common. So if the dose is 2 milligrams, then you might have a toxic effect at 4 or 5 milligrams. Very rarely you will see doses as little as a couple of eye drops in the eye can cause severe or life-threatening reactions. When I was a young pharmacist, the ophthalmology office was across the street from ER, and we had 2 cases where patients had gone in and had their eyes dilated and had severe reactions and had to be rushed over to the emergency room. So this is some more datura that comes out of my backyard. You can see in the top left-hand side, that's what the little buds look like before they open up. Down on the bottom left is what the flowers look like. This is true for almost all of the deadly nightshade plants. They open up and they unfurl counterclockwise. The datura blooms and you can see the 5 different petals. Those in my yard are about 12 to 14 inches long, so they're quite big, and 4 or 5 inches across, so almost the size of the palm of your hand. The blooms don't last very long, but they're proficient. So when taking recreationally, and datura is occasionally used as a party drug or at raves, it can cause very high fevers, up to 105 or 110 degrees, which can lead to irreversible brain damage, organ failure, and death all by itself. The dry mouth, which isn't easily satisfied by drinking water, can lead to an overdose of water. Water intoxication is a real thing, and it's possible to die from just drinking too much water. Anecdotally, hallucinations experienced by thrill seekers or those in search of dreams or prophetic visions are described as unpleasant. They are described as a living dream where you fall in and out of consciousness and you are completely unconnected with reality. You might ignore some stimuli or respond to ones that aren't there. They say that you will talk to people who aren't there or see people who aren't there and then carry on a conversation with them. These tropine alkaloids are among the very few drugs which cause what are called true hallucinations, hallucinations that cannot be distinguished from reality. For example, if you're drunk and you see a pink elephant, you know there isn't actually a pink elephant in the room. But if you're having a true hallucination, you might jump out the window because you know that you're about to be trampled to death by the pink elephant in the room. The ability to fly is one of the more common hallucinations that people experience. And this is one of the reasons why these drugs were so important in the witches' flying ointments, because they cause you to think you can fly. The hallucinations can last for several hours to several days or several weeks. So just think about it. If you're having a bad trip, so to speak, or bad hallucinations, and they're going on for weeks and weeks, you would do almost anything to make them stop. Anytime anyone presents to the emergency room with hallucinations, datura and atropine should be considered and ruled out. Again, atropine and scopolamine have a reputation for aphrodisiacs. Scopolamine in particular is sort of a waking sleep, so you can guide someone into a sexual experience that they would not normally consent to. These plants and alkaloids play a very important role in some religions, even to this day. Datura is one of the easiest poison plants to grow and one of the most common found out in the wild. Actually, growing datura is never a hard thing. Controlling it or getting rid of it in your yard is the hard part. I gave away all my datura seeds one year at a talk, and so I had to come home and plant some more. And that was about 15 years ago. I haven't planted it since, and I have it in the front, in the back, in the pasture, everywhere. You just really have to work very hard to get rid of it or to make it not grow. So the next plant we're going to talk about is mandrake, which is the Tropea mandragoria, again, part of the deadly nightshade. Again, the atropine alkaloids are found, but mandrake has really interesting mythology. So mandrake is fabled to grow underneath the gallows of a murderer whose blood has fed the earth. It's said to shriek and utter terrible groans as it's pulled from the ground, causing death or insanity. So this little picture over on the left shows you that when what the old books and the herbal books will tell you is that you tied a string to the mandrake plant and then tied it to a dog and moved so that you were out of hearing range and called the dog to you or pulled the dog to you. So when the mandrake was pulled out of the ground and shrieked and cried, you wouldn't hear them. Mandrake is found in a lot of literature. Shakespeare refers to mandrake 4 times and mandragoria twice. So we see a couple of examples here. What with loathsome smells and shrieks, the mandrake cries when it's pulled from the earth. The living mortals here, hearing them run mad. And where such things here as we do speak about, or have we eaten the insane root? So that would be mandrake. Mandrake is mentioned as a medicinal plant in the El Papyrus from about 1700 BC. It's talked about in the Bible. Jacob's infertile second wife, Rachel, barters with Leah for the root. In the literature, the roots which are quite long, maybe 2 to 3 feet long, and have an oddly human form. If there's a single root, then it's said to be female, and if the taproot splits in 2, then it's said to be male. There are often little small rootlets growing from the top, and they appear as arms, and then numerous fine roots can appear as hair. The amphiporic roots, so the male roots are said to have different properties than the female roots. The male roots are more powerful. The narcotic properties of mandrake made it one of the most important plants in the Middle Ages. Mandrake was a precursor for anesthesia. So before we had ether in the middle 1800s, then they used mandrake, but you had to be very, very careful because the sleep that it induced could become permanent. So again, these drugs all have very narrow therapeutic ranges. So a little bit is enough to cause a powerful effect, and a tiny fraction more can be enough to cause death, which again makes it very good for murder mystery writers. In Harry Potter, mandrake is a powerful restorative. It's used to return people who've been transfigured or cursed back to their original state. If you remember, the teacher gives them all headphones so that they won't hear the mandrake when it's shrieked. And because they're dealing with baby mandrake plants, they'll only be stunned. It won't actually kill them when they're repotting them. Mandrake was also believed to be a universal antidote. So these finds have a lot of fun, different things that you can toss into a murder mystery. Mandrake is a perennial with leaves that arise directly from the roots. So there's no stalk. They grow in a rosetta pattern. When they first emerge, they stand up erect, but you won't hardly ever see that. As they grow, they flatten out. Plants for almost all of these plants are really fairly large. Mandrake is about 12 inches and 4 or 5 inches across, and pointed at the apex. The flowers again have that 5 pointed bell shapes. They're white the ones in my yard are kind of a off-white with a lot of purple and a little bit of yellow veining in them. The fruits, which are ripe, they turn yellow. They're a yellow golden and are about the size of a small apple. They never get ripe in my yard. We just don't have the right weather for them. So I always have the green unripe fruits. 1934, Mandrake, named for the poison, the magician, became the first costume crime fighter. He's the precursor to Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man. So I always think these are really fun, and you can find these comics around occasionally, and they're kind of cute. So we're going to change a little bit and talk about nicotine. So many of the poison plants that are recognized today were originally introduced as socially acceptable recreational drugs. Notable examples include strychnine and cocaine, which were incorporated into tonics and pick-me-ups, and medicinal spirits before their flaws of high toxicity and drug dependency became apparent. There are 2 poisonous plant classes that have survived as common legal stimulants. conquering the world despite their adverse effects and their risk of use. The first, and the one we're going to talk about today, is nicotine from tobacco. The second is caffeine that's found in tea, coffee, chocolate, cola, and a couple of other little plants. So historically, tobacco is thought to originate in South America and to migrate north through Mexico, where it was evidentially cultivated as early as 1400 BCE. The dog is helping me with the computer here. So it moved north with indigenous peoples, where it was used as a medicine, in ceremonies, as a currency, as a gift of friendship. Jean Nicole was the French ambassador to Portugal, and he introduced nicotine to France in about 1570. Sir Walter Raleigh introduced smoking for pleasure into the court of Queen Elizabeth. Tobacco rapidly spread around the world and became very popular. But because it's a new world poison, there's very little in the way of folklore and mythology. So while it can be a relatively boring poison, it does have effectiveness and availability on its side. As a general rule of thumb, we think of if it breathes, it dies. So tobacco is a very good poison plant. Tobacco is, again, a member of the nightshade family. So with datura, henbane, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, ginseng, weed, and mandrake. These nightshade plants can be grown for drugs, and they can be grown for commercial products like tobacco. They can be found in a witch's garden or a poison plant garden because of their powerful effects. Like other members of the nightshade family, tobacco has tubular roots, 5-lobed flowers that are generally white to yellow to greenish occasionally. One of the most common forms of tobacco actually has kind of pretty pink flowers. So they have simple, broad, hairy, strongly scented leaves, and the fruits are capsules, again, with many small seeds. Tobacco is widely cultivated for its use in cigarettes, cigars, chewing tobacco, smoke, pipe, and snuff. Tobacco can be grown as an ornamental in your yard and can be found as an escape back into the wild. So this is what my tobacco looks like. There is one, again, that has a really pretty little pink flower. These flowers are very small. So remember, I told you the datura flowers are about 12 inches long and about 4 or 5 inches across. These flowers are about 3 to 4 inches long and maybe an inch or about an inch across. So these are some of the different forms of tobacco that are out of my personal toy box. So on the left, you see snuff, then cigarettes. The glass jar in the middle shows you what tobacco looks like when you strip it out of a cigarette. The Blackleaf 40 was the commercial insecticide that was available in the United States. And then you have some rolling tobacco and a few other little things here. So cigarettes contain about 10 to 30 milligrams of nicotine per cigarette. Snuff, which is the powdered form of tobacco leaves, contains between 4 and 30 milligrams of moist snuff, or about 15 milligrams per gram of the dry snuff. Chewing tobacco is about 3 milligrams per gram. The actual dose of nicotine that's delivered from a cigarette is very small, about 1 to 2 milligrams. About 5 to 7 milligrams is left in a cigarette butt, which means 2 to 3 milligrams can kill a small child or a pet. 6 to 10 butts can kill an adult. So if you don't want to go down to the smoke shop and buy cigarettes, you can just collect the cigarette butts. I don't know about where you live, but there are still a lot of places where people go outside of restaurants, outside of all kinds of places and smoke. So it's not hard to find cigarette butts around where I live. Nicotine gum is available as 2 milligrams. It's buffered to be about 8.5, which increases its buccal absorption or absorption through mucous membranes. The patches come in 7, 14, and 21 milligrams. The oral ingestion of topical patches, which sounds terrible, but apparently happens a lot if you read the literature, can lead to a delayed onset of action because, again, you're not getting a straight dose of the nicotine. It's having to be leached out of the pack and slowly absorbed into the system. So this can increase the length for the onset of action. Ingestion of topical patches or sucking on the patches is actually one of the most common ways children are accidentally poisoned, because as we know, kids and animals will pick up anything they find and put it in their mouth. Drugs like protonics and Pepsid, which a lot of people take, they decrease the acid in the stomach, which will significantly increase the amount of nicotine absorbed orally. So just as a quick thing, the Bindi cigarettes that are from India and Southeast Asia actually contain a lot less tobacco, but are doctored to have about 3 times the average American cigarette in nicotine. You can always add more nicotine to a cigarette, to a patch, to chewing tobacco to increase toxicity. Nicotine in vaping liquids is available in a variety of concentrations between 5 milligrams per milliliter or 50 milligrams per milliliter or even greater, and comes in a variety of flavors. And so this is actually why nicotine makes such a good poison. Although commercial insecticides are no longer on the market, Black Leaf 40 was the most common. There are lots of DIY instructions that are available. So back in the 60s and 70s, and even up until the beginning of the 80s, nicotine was the natural, organic, easy insecticide. The problem is that it kills everything, including yourself if you're not careful when you're making your nicotine tea or spraying it on your plants. It was good in the fact that nothing survived it, so there wasn't any problem with resistance developing because it breaks down in sunlight and in the environment. So you could spray your plants today and then eat them after washing them tomorrow. So that was part of the good things. The bad things were that it was incredibly toxic. So it killed everything that came in contact with it. Good bugs, bad bugs, insects, flying insects like bees, everything. So to make a nicotine tea, so if you're writing your book and you want to not have to go to the store and buy tobacco because you don't want any history tying you to it, you take 2 to 3 cigarettes for a non-smoker or 3 or 4 cigarettes for a smoker, put it in a small amount of water, put it in a cool, dark spot because sunlight or daylight will break down the nicotine. You wait for about an hour up to 24 hours, and then just strain it off. The tea will have a light yellow color, will smell strongly of tobacco and have a bitter taste, but it is perfectly possible to just disguise this in food or drink, especially something strong like maybe a flavored coffee or an espresso. Some of the dark red wines will do it. You have to be very careful and not spill it on yourself because a few drops can be enough to cause a person to become very ill, and 5 or 6 drops can be enough to kill. So we have a few different examples. You see the black leaf 40 on the bottom left, the package of Marlboros and the tea. That tea is TI made. So you can see that it's old because it's black, and if you could smell it, it has a very strong odor. Then you can see some of the advertisements where they talked about black leaf 40 on, they actually put it in roost for chickens because it kills the lice and the mites that get on birds. It was sprayed in yards to keep pets away, which totally makes no sense to me because it's as likely to kill a cat or a dog as it is to keep them away. And then you see all of the advertisements where people are spraying it on their crops. But again, one of the problems with it was that it was incredibly dangerous. So nicotine in its purest and most deadly form has become significantly easier, safer to obtain and handle. So it's the e-cigarette liquids. In September of 2023, there were more than 6,000 different e-cigarette products available in the United States. 80% of sales were for flavors other than tobacco. So fruits, candies, menthol, mints, and sales exceeded $524 million. So when I went, when e-cigarettes first came on the market, I went down to the little smoke shop and was absolutely appalled at what you could buy. You could buy at that time nicotine that was 100 milligrams per milliliter. We're going to get to it in just a second, but the LD50, the lethal dose 50% of the time. So I give everybody in the group the same exact amount of nicotine. Half of you would die and half of you would wish you had died. But the LD50 is 40 to 60 milligrams. That is a phenomenally small amount, especially when you consider that you can buy 50 milligrams per milliliter as a refill cartridge for some of these e-cigarettes. That means a milliliter, which is about 1/8 of a teaspoonful, about 15 drops is enough to kill somebody. And this gets away from all of the disadvantages of making your own nicotine tea because it comes in flavors. So you can get cherry, watermelon, mint, tea. I have some of the candy flavors have been legislatured out of existence. So you can't really go in and buy watermelon or bubble gum anymore. Because that made it too enticing for children. So they really don't want you to be able to get the fancy fruit flavors, but that doesn't mean you can't get cherry and grape and lemon. Those are still available. So all of these things are just staggeringly available. You can buy them at the gas station, at the grocery store, at smoke shops. It's just, as a pharmacist and a toxicologist, it just absolutely blows my mind that such a potent poison is so readily available. Because vaping has become kind of a, smoking, people didn't like it because you were releasing a lot of secondhand smoke into the environment. It smelled bad. So then you went from the original cigarettes to chewing tobacco because then you didn't have to have the lit cigarettes. And then you got vaping, which everybody thought was going to be the answer to cigarette smoking. It was going to be a way to help you stop smoking, which that isn't true. It doesn't work that way. It wouldn't be smelly. It wouldn't be what was considered dirty. It wouldn't have much nicotine put out into the environment. Well, now that vaping has gotten a bad name because we know that the vapors do actually have nicotine in them. And so it's just become a thing. When I was updating this talk, I was just reading on the internet, and it turns out that now they have these tiny little nicotine pouches, And so they're very small. They're meant to be put between your lip and gum, or between the side of your mouth and your gums. Contains nicotine. It's derived from tobacco, so it's the same nicotine as all the others. You can get it in a variety of different strengths. So 3 milligrams is the least potent, and 15 milligrams is the most potent. So at the top left-hand side, you can see this is a 15 milligram pouch. There are 20 pouches in a container. So that's enough nicotine to kill potentially about 7 people. I went on Amazon to look and see how available this was. You can order it from Amazon. 20 pouches is roughly about $14, give or take. So you got to consider that's about $2 per person that you're going to kill. It really is just staggering how available this is. You can see the little picture that the pouches are roughly the size of a fingernail. So very small. Again, they come in lots of different flavors. One of the things that you'll notice if you go on the internet to look at and see about buying some of these things is that there are a lot of them that are advertised as tobacco-free or nicotine-free. Well, what they have in them is caffeine. So we already know that caffeine is a potentially lethal drug. So we think of it as something that we all indulge in, but it is perfectly possible to have too much caffeine and get all kinds of side effects and potentially lethal effects. So all poisons are dose dependent. That's what makes them so effective for murder mystery writers. If I had a nickel worth of pure nicotine, a nickel currency weighs 5 grams. So if I had the weight of a nickel in pure nicotine, that would be enough to kill 100 adults. Nicotine is classified as a super toxin because the dose is so small. It's a liquid at room temperature. It's water soluble with a pH of 8.5. So again, you just have to toss a little base in there and you've got perfectly water soluble. Pure nicotine is colorless and odorless, but it does have a bitter taste. That's why the candied flavors are so common in the nicotine and e-cigarette products. A nicotine tea that you make yourself will be pale yellow to dark brown, turning black as it ages. And there is a strong smell and taste. Nicotine is best absorbed by inhalation, although it easily crosses the mucous membranes or through intact or abraded skin. The fastest way is again through the lungs, then through the mucous membranes, and then through abraded skin, and finally intact skin. It is not well absorbed orally. So if you take it or you're giving your victim an oral dose, it's not really a problem because the toxic dose is so small that even when only a small amount is being absorbed, that's enough to kill somebody. That's why nicotine replacement therapies are never given orally. About 40 to 60% of an oral dose is absorbed, makes it past the gut wall, and there's extensive what we call first pass metabolism in the liver. So it goes in through the gut into the bloodstream. That blood goes straight to the liver. A lot of the nicotine then is metabolized to either secondary active products or inactive products. So it's not stable and it's not well absorbed under acidic conditions. But again, we all know that Pepsid and Protonics are drugs that you can buy over the counter that decrease the acidity in the stomach and will significantly increase the amount of nicotine that's absorbed. I need to remind you that nicotine can be added. So pure nicotine from the e-cigarette juice can be added to cigarettes. You can poke holes in the patches with like an insulin syringe and add nicotine to them. Plus that breaks down the barrier so that you get a greater absorption faster. And you can add it to things like chewing tobacco to increase the toxicity. So all parts of the plant are toxic, both fresh and dried. The LD50, the lethal dose 50% of the time, is 40 to 60 milligrams. That's a very small amount. As little as 1 milligram in a child or 2 to 5 milligrams can cause nausea and vomiting. Think about high school. I don't know about when you were in high school, but when I was in high school, everybody swiped their parents' cigarettes or their chewing tobacco and went out behind the school to experiment. And the first time you use almost any tobacco product, it will cause nausea and vomiting. So the kids who do that sort of thing invariably get sick the first time, which was enough for me to make me never want to do it again. So I was never a smoker, but it's just incredible how such a deadly poison, a super poison, can be purchased everywhere, literally almost everywhere. The smoke shop where I go to when I need to buy something for a talk or to put in the toy cabinet is manned by a family. And normally when you go in there, you won't find the parents. They'll be their high school age daughter in there. She's not legally old enough to buy nicotine, but she'll be in that shop selling it. And again, I live in a very small town, so things like that happen that you might not see in a big city where you might live. So large doses, small doses will cause nausea and vomiting. Very small doses have a stimulating effect. They actually make you feel a little better, and they affect the dopamine and nicotine receptors in the brain, which is why nicotine can be so addictive and so difficult to stop. Larger doses, like atropine, will cause abdominal pain, increased salivation, dizziness, headache. Initially, your heart rate and your blood pressure goes up. Finally, you'll have some confusion and agitation. Lethal doses will cause lethargy, convulsions, and a decrease in heart rate and blood pressure, and death will be from respiratory failure. There's no specific antidote, but with timely and supportive hospital care, patients can survive. The half-life in the body is relatively short, maybe 1 to 2 hours. The onset of action can be very quick, 5 to 30 minutes, or it can be delayed for several hours. Again, this is one of the reasons why poisons can be so good for our murder mystery writers, because there are such a large variety of factors that we can change to make it more effective for you. Symptoms are dose dependent, and they're dependent on route of exposure. Death can again occur very rapidly, say within 15 minutes, or it can take hours. All of these things, all of these side effects happen very fast. So chances are, if you give your nicotine in the kitchen, they're going to be found dead on the floor in a puddle of vomit, because death can be very, very fast. So this is a picture of the toy cabinet where I keep what we call the toy box, where I keep the poisons in my house. And then, do you have any questions that I can answer for you? I went through it pretty fast because they told me I couldn't talk all afternoon long. So, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. My email and text are listed on the card. I will tell you that my email is very messed up right now. I don't think I'm getting all of them, and they go to trash and junk, and you have to hunt for them. So if you try and email me and you don't hear back from me in a day or so, then either try again or text me, because until I can find probably a high school kid who can fix my email, I may not be answering email, but I will answer questions. That's what I do. Murder mystery writers send me questions, and then we'll discuss all the different poisons that might work for them.
Lucy, this is Rick. I've got a series of questions from the audience here, and I'll start at the beginning.
Okay.
The first one is monkshood venom, fast acting through skin contact. A question?
Yes, monkshood is actually my favorite poison plant because it is absolutely gorgeous. It is the most deadly common garden plant found in the northern parts of the United States and in Europe and Great Britain. It doesn't grow well in Texas, although this year I am successfully growing monkshood and it should start to bloom almost any time now. If you want to see a picture, probably I can get to a picture pretty easily. I'll have to skip forward, but no, I love aconite and I think it's a great poison plant. It is absorbed well orally. And it will go through either intact or abraded skin, and it's fairly fast and the dose is fairly low, but it's a beautiful plant.
Got a question here about fire ants. The fire ant venom is toxic. You can kill someone with it.
You can actually, if there are people that will have such a severe allergic reaction that it can be life-threatening. They have to carry an EpiPen or sometimes move to a part of the United States that doesn't have fire ants. But you can also extract the poison and then inject it in somebody. So you're getting a concentrated dose directly into the bloodstream, and it can be very fatal. So, and again, it's the dose is very small. I mean, just think how painful the tiny fraction of a dose that you get from a bite. I'm lucky, I don't get ant bites very often, but even with me, it can cause a reaction that's the size of a small eraser and very painful.
A question about what is the witch's flying ointment?
So a witch's flying ointment, is from the Middle Ages. And up until about the 1850s, you'll still find it in reference books. They usually put something like datura or henbane or atropia, and then they would grind it up and put it in an ointment along with aconite and opium and whatever poison plants that were available or whatever they had wherever they were living. And then they would smear it on their bodies, and it would cause hallucinations. And because all of the atropine alkaloids, the deadly nightshade plants, cause hallucination of flying, then that's where the name flying ointment came from, So we all know at Halloween, you see the witches on broomsticks and they're supposed to be flying. Well, they actually did put this ointment on their bodies to cause these hallucinations. And flying is a very common hallucination for the atropine alkaloids.
Do most over-the-counter eye drops have enough poison that could be used to murder someone? Asking
They
for a
do.
friend.
You won't find atropine in the over-the-counter eye drops. Those are prescription eye drops. But there is like Visine, which is tetrahydrolazine. There's that's the poison in poison eye drops. So you can get enough because they usually come in 15 milliliter bottles, and 15 milliliters of a 2% solution is plenty to kill somebody.
Are pollinators or garden pests instantly killed by exposure, slight exposure to datura?
No, actually, pollinators won't die from the datura plants. I have bees, and my bees actually love my datura. You can, certain poison plants, actually get poisoned honey from the pollinators, the bees that use the nectar from the poison plant. The most common one here in Texas and in San Diego, where you would live, would be oleander. Bees that only get their pollen from oleanders produce toxic honey.
Wow. On the same note, how do you protect yourself in your garden? when you dispose of cuttings and trimmings, or do you have pets that can avoid?
I've always had dogs, and I've had a poison garden for about 30 years. My dogs have never once got into the poisons. And I have all kinds of poisons all over my yard, different things. I grow oleander and datura, monkshood, lily of the valley, castor beans. I've never had a problem. I occasionally will go out and do something in the yard and get something on my hands. I don't really like garden gloves. And if I am not careful and don't come in and wash my hands off, I have had the odd little bit of toxicity, but I think familiarity is definitely one of those things that breeds contempt. I handle the arsenic and all the poisons in my house. I have them in my house. I handle them when I'm talking about them. They live in, actually, I have a floor to ceiling bookcase, glassed in, locked doors, bookcase in my kitchen. And that's where the toy box is. The poison plants live. So I tend to kind of poo-poo a lot of the poisons. Every time, you read in the paper, I live in Central Texas, but every once in a while you'll see kids that go to Mexico and get the little drops of mercury in the glass vials, and then they'll play with them and they drop and the glass vials break. We had a school in West Texas and kid broke one of the glass vials in a classroom, and they closed the entire school and spent $100,000 on remediation. I'm like, give me a roll of paper towels and I'll go in there and clean it up for you. People have just sort of lost their minds when it comes to poisons, because then you can go to the gas station and buy nicotine. I mean, we've totally lost our common sense where poisons are concerned. But no, I'm pretty cavalier about going out in the yard. I toss my cuttings in the compost pile, which is one of the reasons why I have datura growing everywhere, because almost you have to bring it in and throw it out in the trash if you don't want it to just grow all over your yard.
Could you explain what you mean by if it breathes, it dies?
Just what it says. If it breathes, it dies. So you would see all the different kinds of bugs will die. Any kind of mammal that breathes. It was advertised to put it on your chickens, and I never understood why the chickens didn't die. But generally speaking, if you're reading the literature and you're talking about a lethal dose of nicotine, if it has a respiratory system, it dies. It causes respiratory failure. So any kind of mammal, any kind of insect, and they die fast. So that was the reason it was touted for 20 plus years. You saw it in all of the organic gardening manuals. You saw it on NPR when they did the gardening shows. Because everything dies so fast, there's no chance of resistance. Now, when we have pesticides, part of the problem is that if you use it all the time, or you use it for consecutive years, sometimes the bugs will become immune, and so they won't be affected by the insecticide. So if it has a respiratory system, nicotine will kill it.
There's a question here about nicotine statistics. How much risk are chain smokers at risk, and how long does it take to pass the level of nicotine from the body?
Smokers tend to build up a little bit of resistance. So when we were talking about making your own nicotine tea, 2 to 3 cigarettes is enough to kill enough nicotine extracted out of that amount of tobacco to kill a non-smoker. So that'd be, if we say there's 25 or 30 milligrams of nicotine in a cigarette, you're not going to get perfect extraction. So that'd be, say, 75 milligrams of nicotine will kill a non-smoker. Again, we said the LD50 is 40 to 60 milligrams. So you will always have people that are more sensitive that a smaller dose will kill, or you have a small adult where a smaller dose will kill, or you'll always have some people that are just particularly resistant to medication and they'll require a bigger dose. A smoker will require roughly twice the amount of a non-smoker. So they do have some resistance. If you have someone who smokes and I'm assuming you want to be able to measure nicotine in their urine or in their bloodstream, then, after you smoke a cigarette, you'll see nicotine levels in the urine in about 40 minutes. So we make about 0.5 milliliter a minute for urine. So you want, about 40 minutes to be able to detect a cigarette smoke in your urine. And it would be slightly shorter amount of time for blood. But if you're just doing a down and dirty test in the emergency room for nicotine poisoning, you test urine, and it's a fairly easy test.
Now, this is kind of a comment and a question. I think it says there have been reported cases of people dying or nearly dying after making a shake with pure caffeine.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that, or have you had an experience with that?
I know that most people will get between 100 and 200 milligrams a day from, their morning coffee or a couple of Cokes or a couple of energy drinks. I know that you start to really see toxic symptoms somewhere around 400 milligrams and can kill somebody with somewhere between 600 and 800 milligrams. So you occasionally will see people who are exhibiting a rapid heartbeat, their hands will shake after just a couple of energy drinks. When I worked at the hospital, we had technicians who would be having the Red Bull for breakfast. And, if they had to show up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning and they'd had 2 or 3 by the middle of the morning, they would be having symptoms. And occasionally you will just think about yourselves. If you drink too much coffee, and I'm a big coffee drinker, every once in a while, if you've had too much, you'll start to feel your heartbeat, you'll feel a little sweaty, maybe a little nauseated. But the rapid heartbeat is something that a lot of people have experienced just from self-poisoning when you just overindulged in the amount of caffeine. Occasionally I will have that. No-dose, I think, has 100 milligrams of caffeine per capsule, and people who do 4 or 5 capsules get enough caffeine to cause serious effects. The chewing gum for caffeine is usually about 50 milligrams, so you'd have to have 6 or 8 pieces of the chewing gum and chew them all at once. The little pouches, like the nicotine pouches that you can buy on Amazon, so they're tiny little pouches that you can just put in your mouth and they dissolve. They have roughly 50 milligrams. I think most of them have 50 milligrams per patch. So they'll tell you that 2 patches is equivalent to a strong cup of coffee. And so they recommend no more than 2 pouches or 2 pieces of gum. But of course, we know that in America, we all believe that if 2 is the dose, I'm going to take 3 or 4. And maybe if push comes to shove, I'm going to take 6 or 7 or 8. That's one of the problems with acetaminophen, why acetaminophen is such a dangerous drug, because, 8 is a potential lethal dose. And when I was working in Waco, which has Baylor University, 2 or 3 times a month, we would get young women who went out on a Thursday for ladies' night, would drink a little too much, go home, take a handful of Tylenol, so they'd be able to go to not be hungover, they thought, when they went to class on Friday morning. If they woke up in the middle of the night, they were likely to take another 4 or 6 Tylenol. So then by Friday mornings, they would be sick and they would be going to the health center and then spend the weekend in my hospital getting the antidote. And it was so common that nobody was even surprised when we saw those cases come in. They were significant numbers that, you know, we just expected to see a couple of months. It was a big deal kind of thing. And that's why you see acetaminophen in the toy box. So it's on the top shelf of the left-hand picture. Because I really think acetaminophen is probably the most dangerous drug in anybody's home. Not because it's the most toxic, but because it has a wide perception of safety.
Well, I think you answered this next question. How would you go about killing somebody with caffeine? But I think with the shakes and all these other things, I think you kind of answered that one already.
Yeah.
Are there any restrictions on
One of the things I did for fun when I was going to do a caffeine talk was I just went on the internet and ordered a pound of caffeine, pure caffeine from a chemical wholesaler. Don't have it in the poison cabinet, but it's a lovely package with all these different warnings and poison symbols on it and everything. But again, you know you're in trouble when you can go online and buy a pound of any poison, pretty much without any questions asked. The bottom middle of the two pictures has my bottle of cyanide. And when I went online to buy cyanide, the smallest container I could buy was a pound. So that's my pound jar of cyanide there on the bottom shelf.
There's a question here. A person says they know that poppy is restricted sometimes to grow. Is there any restrictions on what you can grow in your garden?
No, most of these drugs are actually not considered. You know, if I was growing wholesale and are extracting the chemicals, then there might be a problem. But you can go to the plant nursery and buy almost all of these plants. I get castor bean, lily of the valley, oleander, datura. What you won't find really easily is henbane. Henbane, you would have to go on the internet, and the places where you get henbane seeds usually will be advertising it as something for either a poison garden or a witch's garden. And there are whole websites out there that are just talk about plants to grow for your witches' potions in your backyard. So that's where my henbane came from originally. My deadly nightshade came from a bird. So I was really lucky there because, you know, I've had that forever. And I just replant my seeds every year to get more.
I'm coming to the end here of questions. Are there any poisons that are neutralized by heat, i.e. they couldn't be used in baked goods?
There are a few. I would have to stop and think about it because none of the ones we talked about today are neutralized by heat. So yeah, there are a few, but I would have to think about it. Probably I think some of the henbanes are not, some of the hemlocks are not really temperature stable. But again, I'd have to think about it.
On your garden, what do you use your poison garden for?
Mostly I use it for murder mystery authors. So if somebody emails me and said, I need to know what the plant looks like in the early spring when it's first coming up. Well, I had pictures from my yard. Or a question I had a couple of months ago was, what do datura leaves smell like when they're burned? Well, I'd never done that. So I went out and picked a bunch of leaves off my plants and let them dry out, and then went out in the backyard and lit them on fire in a bowl and sniffed them to see what they would smell like. And they don't smell good. So I could email back and say they have a kind of musty, mousy smell.
There's a question.
So I use it mostly for authors, and for things like, occasionally I will give a talk and I will hand out seeds just because people want to know what they look like. And the datura seeds are really very much can be disguised as red pepper flakes. So, you know, the red pepper that you would see on pizzas or any kind of spicy food. Well, that's pretty much what datura looks like if you sprinkle. When I was cooking mine to make them into a poison for a slide, I simply harvested my seeds, whipped up a little egg white, tossed the seeds in there, sprinkled a little paprika on them, and put them in the oven to bake. And you really cannot tell them from red pepper flakes.
Oh.
I don't have the slide in this talk, but I do have some mixed in with red pepper flakes, and you would be hard put to distinguish which was the poison seed and which was just the regular red pepper flake. For authors, sometimes I will you gather a poison plant and then you can say chop it up and show what it would look like if it was mixed into a salad. Or one year I dried all of the different poison plants in my yard, ground them up in the coffee grinder, and you would not be able to differentiate it from, say, sage or oregano or any of the other little herbs that were in your cooking cabinet, you know. Not that you can see it very well, but one of the poisons in the glass jar in the poison cabinet in the toy box is just ground up plant seeds, leaves from the poison garden. So just things that you could readily mix into any kind of food. You know, you could do things like castor beans look a whole lot like pinto beans. So if you were cooking it to make poison beans for your dinner guest, that's what you would, that's where I would put castor beans anyway. Although you could grind them up and put them in almost anything, because that's another one of the poisons where the toxic dose is just phenomenally small. 1 or 2 seeds would be enough. And I have a really funny seed packet that I bought in the grocery store, and on the front of the seed packet says, fatal if ingested orally, do not swallow. So you know, I think those are just hysterical. Anytime I find something like that in you know, the grocery store or Walmart or the plant nursery or the hobby stores are really good. Health food stores are a place where I usually go in and peruse for poisons. You'd be absolutely amazed what you can find in just random places. Garage sales will have old chemicals, estate sales, farm sales, antique stores. I buy more arsenic than you can possibly imagine, often in antique stores. That's where I would first go to look if I were looking for arsenic.
Interesting. With castor beans, will they show up in an autopsy?
You have to look for it. You have to know what you're looking for, or you have to have some suspicion. I mean, castor bean will kind of cause widespread multi-organ failure. And so if you saw that in an autopsy, you'd be thinking, what caused this? Because it's the only time you would see it naturally occurring would be somebody who had an incredibly high fever. So occasionally you'll find somebody who especially in South Texas, passes out somewhere or gets sunstroke, and they just get these really incredibly high body fevers. And so then they'll have organ failure, not immediately, usually takes 5 to 14 days for the organ failure to become life-threatening. But when you see that, you'll be looking for a drug exposure, a heat exposure, something like that, where you would be looking for some reason to cause that kind of multi-organ failure. Very occasionally, you'll see it with a really bad infection. So if you get a severe sepsis that affects more than one organ. You can see that where you start to have heart failure and liver failure and sometimes kidney failure all at the same time. Well, then you're looking for either an infection or exposure to some sort of medication. So if you were looking for it, you could find it, but it's not something that would just pop out at you or show up on any kind of generic blood test. There's really no such thing as a generic blood test. You know, if you have, you're sending samples to the lab, they're going to call you and say, what am I looking for? Am I looking for a metal like arsenic or mercury or lead? Am I looking for something like a plant, so an alkaloid or a cardiac glycoside? Am I looking for something, you know, like nicotine or asbestos or arsenic or something? So you would just be looking for, you need to have some guide to what you're looking for. And talking about the poison plants, I can see out my back window right now, and the deer just jumped in the yard and they're making their way. But unless there is a phenomenal drought in Texas, even the deer don't bother the poison plants. And I've never seen, you read about it in the literature where cattle, especially in the springtime, will, when Johnson grass is growing out, Johnson grass is a cyan, breaks down in the body to make cyanide. So in the spring, when everything is just starting to really grow fast, you'll see the warnings from the vet school or the veterinarians. Sometimes there'll be a warning in the newspaper, you know, not to let your cattle or horses graze over the fence line. All the farmers around here would know to get the Johnson grass out of the yard, but it does grow along almost all of our fence lines. So if the cattle or horses will stick their heads over the fence and graze sometimes, and you'll see cyanide intoxication from Johnson grass.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions I found. If I've missed any, I'm sorry, but we've got your email and contact information. So if one of our members has a question, they can get in touch with you. That's okay?
Yeah, that's fine. If you don't hear from me in a day or two, then nag, because chances are I missed your email. I have no idea why my email is so corrupted at the moment, but it is. And I am not sufficiently computer savvy to be able to fix it. I'm going to have to find a high school kid. That's always my answer, you know. And I live in a small enough town that you can call the high school and say, send me a kid to come fix my internet or fix my TiVo or whatever it is you've got that's not working.
Hey,
Send them
Rick,
here when you're done, when you find one.
Yeah.
Hi, Rose.
Back to
Hey,
Karen
Rick,
here. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, yeah, I just saw a few more questions.
Oh, they're coming in.
Like Donna asked, what about poisonous mushrooms? What's the most common one?
In truth, the old saying is there are bold mushroom hunters and old mushroom hunters, but no bold old mushroom hunters. Most little brown mushrooms can be potentially very toxic. And what is growing one year and looks exactly the same as the mushroom that grows the next year, it's really difficult to, unless it's like an amanita where it's red and has little white dots on it, you know. Unless I were really well trained, which I am not, I would never harvest any kind of wild mushroom. I would consider them all toxic. And again, growing season and temperature and soil conditions, mushrooms are particularly noted for picking up any kind of contamination in soil. So if you find mushrooms growing on the side of a highway, they'll all have lead in them because they pick it up from the exhaust that was there back when leaded gasoline was still a thing.
Wow.
If you have you live in the part of the country where arsenic is found in the soil, all the mushrooms, even the safe mushrooms, will have arsenic in it because they get up out of the soil. So I would trust no mushroom and consider all of them to be potentially toxic. And even if there is a safe mushroom, you know, it changes all the time. And you would have to be very knowledgeable to be able to go out and free range source mushrooms. I wouldn't do it. And if you look in the books, you know, it's almost impossible to tell a safe mushroom from a toxic mushroom unless it's one of the highly colored ones, which there are a few. So some of the amanitas are bright reds. You always know when you see a bright red or highly colored mushroom that nearly all of those are toxic.
I saw one more question. With castor beans, will they show up in an autopsy?
Again, you would have to be looking for it because you're going to get catastrophic or multi-organ failure with castor bean poisoning. You're going to be looking for what causes that. But even when, you know, in the 60s, when you had Grigory Markov was poisoned, he was poked in the back of the leg with an umbrella, and they put in a tiny little bead. It was injected into the back of his leg. Well, he knew he was doing like free Europe. That wasn't exactly the one he was doing, but he went to the hospital and said, look, I've been poisoned. And he eventually died after about 3 or 4 days. And because he had told them exactly what was going on, you know, I've been poisoned. This is where it is in my body. This was how I was injected. This is probably what the poison is. Well, they weren't able to do anything about that. He was dead man walking from the very beginning. And even with very, very close autopsy, looking for that little pellet that was injected in the back of his leg from an umbrella gun. So that was the Russian thing, you know, and if you go to some of the museums, they'll have replicas of it. And that wasn't the first case. You know, they had a couple of other cases, one in France and another one in Great Britain, where the individuals didn't die for some reason or other. Either the pellet didn't go in far enough, or they didn't dissolve out for one reason or another. Not everybody who was injected died, but the doses, I mean, these were microscopic pellets that had been drilled and then had the poison put inside. So we are talking one of the most, castor ricin is one of the most toxic poisons out there. So it's up there with sarin gas and botulism, up there were just micrograms, fractions of molecule will be enough to kill somebody, just phenomenally low doses.
One other question I just saw here about what about bitter almonds for poison? Could you bake that into something?
You can grind up like apple seeds or the inside of apricot pits or something, and all of those are cyanide glycosides. So there's a cyanide at one end of a sugar molecule. So if you grind it up and then break it down, and breaking it down is really easy. So any kind of weak acid will do it. So stomach acid, anything will just cleave off those cyanide molecules. And cyanide is another one of those compounds. Actually, cyanide and nicotine have roughly the same dose for their LD50. Cyanide is maybe a little less toxic than nicotine. And cyanide is what authors will often email you and say they want something that the person just falls down dead. They take it and die instantly. There's almost nothing that kills you on the indrawn breath. There are a couple of things, but not much. So the closest we'll ever come is probably cyanide, and cyanide is somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. It used to be in Texas at least that car, everything had to have a cyanide antidote kit because you never made it to the emergency room. If you were exposed, you were going to be dead before help ever arrived. I think they've gotten away from some of that now, but there's not nearly as much cyanide around as there used to be. But back in the days when it was used, even in just households, you know, you put it down as ant poison, or you put it out for the bugs, or you used it when you were developing photographs. My pound of arsenic comes from a hobby store where it was sold for people who were developing film in their darkroom. So use a lot of cyanide for that. But you still find cyanide in all kinds of things. If you have a house fire or an industrial fire, you know, we always talk about people don't burn to death. They die of smoke inhalation. Well, the smoke they're inhaling is normally, it'll either be carbon monoxide or it'll be cyanide. And cyanide is actually the more common because most upholstery and most plastics, if they're burned, they're going to give off cyanide gas. So one of the, you know, things is, I never tend to think about my little bit of arsenic or whatever I'm carrying on a plane with me. And I carry arsenic with me to conferences all the time because it's a rock. It looks like a rock. If anybody says anything to you, you say it's a mineral sample, which is true, that I'm going to use in a talk. And nobody has ever questioned it ever. And I've been on a lot of planes with a lot of arsenic. But I always think if there's a crash, my little bit of arsenic isn't going to be the problem. It's going to be all the burning and upholstery and plastic that gives off incredible amounts of cyanide. And the toxic dose of cyanide is 50 to 120 milligrams. So really just almost none.
Wow.
You have to listen to the cyanide talk to know way more about cyanide than that.
I remember a talk of yours. I put it in the chat, but maybe you didn't see it. It was a lot about arsenic in general. And, you know, living in places like New England and upstate New York most of my life where it's very damp. Ever since that talk, I never wanted to live downstream from a Civil War era cemetery. You know,
arsenic is my favorite talk to give. And up in the Northeast and in the Northwest too, where they had apple orchards, there'll be a lot of arsenic because they used to spray it on apple orchards all the time. So it'll be in the soil in a lot of different agricultural places. And it's a naturally occurring contaminant in almost all of, say, Wisconsin across to Washington State, southern Washington State up into Canada. There's just fairly high concentrations of arsenic in all that soil.
but it's also a preservative, right? And that's why it ended up, the bodies of dead soldiers were sent home packed in arsenic so that they would look nice and fresh.
Well, they didn't look fresh, but they weren't decomposed anyway. But yeah, all of the early embalming chemicals were chock full of arsenic and mercury, and then they'd put in some lavender or whatever herbs they had growing around and wrap them up in linen and ship them home. But arsenic is my favorite talk and my favorite poison. So I have a lot of arsenic and know way more than any one person ought to ever know about arsenic, including where to find it. And, you know, again, I would go to an antique store and almost guarantee that in one form or another, I can find arsenic. And arsenic is, of course, a mineral. So it was arsenic when the earth was formed, and it'll be arsenic when the earth is destroyed. It's never going to break down.
We'll have to schedule that for next year, that arsenic talk.
Sure. I love the arsenic talk. It's my favorite.
Well, before we end our meeting, Jennifer Marita has a little update on the anthology, but thank you so much, Lucy. This has just been fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and we'll talk again sometime. And you know, the best thing about poison plants is there's always more plants. So, you know, I'm working on the next one, which will be yew and monkshood and probably autumn crocus, which is colchicine, which is a great poison. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. So yes, so the Farm to Foul Play anthology is moving forward. We have announced the authors, and they're William Bishop, Sarah Bresniker, Chris Strythe, Susan Egan, Karen Harrington, Deborah Henry, Virginia V. Kidd, Karen A. Phillips, Brian Shea, Linda Joy Singleton, Daryl Smith, Joanna Vandervloot, Nick Webster, and Donna Wilberg.
Annie
and
Lane
then-
Faber.
I'm sorry, is she in there? Oh, nope, sorry, that was the wrong one. Sorry. Yes. And then also, here we go. Here is our book cover, designed by Karen Phillips.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with that one, trying
Yeah.
to make it a little creepy.
You did. You succeeded.
And then let's see. I put in the chat, or I was trying to put into the chat. Hold on. We have opportunity to advertise. There you go. So it's in the chat. We have until October 11th for that. And we're working on our book launch event, which will either be in November or possibly early in the winter, early next year. And we're shooting for a publication date either end of October or early November.
Great, thank you. So thanks everybody for attending our meeting today. I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.
Bye.